experts in their field. What I'm going to delve upon in next 15 minutes is primarily focusing on dengue shock syndrome. We all know that the problem of this illness is multifactorial, but when you look into the geographic distribution, these are all areas all across the world which have very high endemicity, and these bright dots where you have little more high prevalence of this disease. If you look into the natural history of the illness, if you talk about human infection, 30% it might be inapparent. It might be just dismissed as a simple viral fever and probably goes undiagnosed. Around 69% may have a dengue fever manifestation, including hemorrhage, and almost dengue fever manifestations, and 10% may have hemorrhagic manifestations or go into dengue shock syndrome. But if you look into reinfection, this figure is around 69%. In addition to the secondary, when you look into the dengue shock syndrome, you would find that almost 5% of the patients may succumb to death, provided they do not reach the centers in time. And world over, the figure varies, which I'll show you in the next table, that the risk infection, which was reported in between 1955 and 2007, there is a huge increase in number of patients. Again, the data are uniformly from all across the globe. And if you look into the case fatality ratio, a study from Thailand, it has gone down, definitely, although the number of cases have increased of dengue. And we do get some kind of epidemic sometimes, and like we had in Delhi in 2007. Some studies across the globe show that if you look into most of the Asian countries, what is startling is this study from Burma, where out of 195 patients, again, please do not go with this figure of 46.2%. That's a very high figure. But here they studied in detail what was the reason for a lot of those patients getting into this. And what they found was that probably most of them had an episode of dengue earlier also. Not only that, primarily a small percentage of people in this had, for the first time, any manifestation of dengue, and they straight away went into dengue shock syndrome. But generally, if you look into the percentage of people going into DSS is around 1% or 1 to 2% in any situation. Why does different clinical manifestations of dengue exist? We all know about the 4 strains which have been identified, and we also understand that recovery from one infection would provide lifelong immunity against that virus, but it may be partial and transient also against subsequent infection by the other 3 viruses. There is evidence that sequential infection increases the risk of developing a hemorrhagic fever, dengue hemorrhagic fever. And the risk factors in dengue shock syndrome which have been identified are, which is highest following an anamnestic dengue infection, particularly if the most recent infection was with dengue strain 2 virus. But this does not in any way prevent development of this as a primary manifestation and a primary infection also. There are certain host factors which may be implicated, which may be gender variation, previous history, individual propensity for capillary leakage, and some viral genetic traits of the type of strain which has infected that individual. One of the latest studies published in Journal of Virology, where they looked into serotyping and they did molecular studies, they found that there is an overabundance of interferon-inducible transcripts. And this is seen in DSS patients, and which is neutrophil associated. Although there was no neutrophilic leukocytosis, but still patients who have an overabundance of these inducible interferons would have high chances of getting into DSS. We all know about the pathogenesis. Once the viremia settles, the manifestations of shock start. So primarily, it is not the virus per se, but is the other factors which are activated, the vasoactive mediators, which cause the decreased vascular permeability and hemorrhagic manifestations. And also, we do find that after 5 to 7 days, when the viremia settles, you will end up with thrombocytopenia and other bone marrow depression, and also decreased levels of other clotting factors and fibrinogen in these patients. What are the signs and symptoms? The most severe form of the disease may have severe abdominal pain, frequent vomiting, disorientation, fluid leakage, heavy bleeding, a sudden drop in blood pressure, and ultimately they may succumb to death in case not managed properly. What are the WHO criteria for DSS? The 4 criteria for dengue hemorrhagic fever, which I'll elucidate in the next slide, plus evidence of circulatory failure in forms of rapid and weak pulse, hypotension, cold clammy skin, and altered mental status. And what are the criteria for hemorrhagic fever is? Fever lasting from 2 to 7 days, evidence of hemorrhagic manifestations or a positive tourniquet test, thrombocytopenia less than 1 lakh, evidence of plasma leakage as shown by hemoconcentration or increase in hematocrit by 20% above the normal for that age, or decrease of hematocrit 20% from the baseline following a fluid replacement therapy, and polyserositis or collection of fluid in peritoneal and pleural cavity along with hyperproteinemia. But mind you, these symptoms which I elucidated in this slide may not be seen, and this classification from dengue may not be met in all the criteria, all the cases you come across. Primarily because some of the markers of DIC may be absent in these patients, and you may not detect a significant hemoconcentration even in many severe dengue patients. This is a study done from India, from BHU, from Lucknow, SGPGI Lucknow, and they found that they did not observe what is the value given of 40% cutoff of hematocrit or 45% cutoff of hematocrit. So you have to see in your setup what it is likely to, and severity cannot be. So all these are guiding factors and pointers for you to understand, but just do not concentrate only in one aspect in diagnosing the case. Patients of DSS who would have poor prognosis would again have signs of central cyanosis, restlessness, a lot of fluid collection. They may go into ARDS, myocardial dysfunction, also encephalopathy, and prolonged shock and hepatic and renal dysfunction. And mind you, a small percentage of people may have dual infection with other organisms also. And who are the patients who are at major risk of bleeding? Those who continue to have a refractory shock or a prolonged shock, have hypertensive shock and renal or liver failure, and severe persistent metabolic acidosis, are being given NSAID sometimes, have pre-existing bleeding tendency, are on anticoagulant therapy, or have any kind of a trauma, including intramuscular injection. Some points for differential diagnosis, we all know, I don't have to delve into that. This is what you have to look into. Some other hemorrhagic fevers, viral hemorrhagic fevers, leptospirosis sometimes, and all other conditions, even complicated malaria. But again, you can very well diagnose all these conditions quite adequately. There are some common misconceptions about it, that it is fatal only due to hemorrhage, but that's not true. DSF is not fatal only due to hemorrhage, but also due to shock. And positive tourniquet test is DHF. That's also not true. It is not specific for dengue hemorrhagic fever. Also, all ages may be involved, and if you look into the literatures, we do not have much literature available till late 80s about adults with dengue. We had a lot of that about pediatric population, but now there's plenty of evidence to suggest that all ages are affected. And what is more important in management is a very close monitoring, infusion of fluids, platelet transfusion, probably overused all over, is not needed. You have to have some specific indications to use that. Managing other complications, and even at best of the centers, you may have a case fatality of 1 to 2%. You can calculate your fluid balance with this formula, but I'll come across, go to an algorithm where you have a better idea of how do you go about managing these patients with dengue hemorrhagic fever. Again, during managing these patients, if you have severe bleeding and severe thrombocytopenia, just do not concentrate only on these aspects. Please look into the shock stage. Give that a top priority. I do not say that you would not try and tackle that. Again, hemodynamic abnormality, dynamic abnormality is equally important. Do not get carried away by elevated liver enzymes. You would see quite often this. And there may be sometimes some unusual manifestations of cases. So do not generalize these guidelines to each and individual case. See the case in toto, what you're dealing with at the bedside. Again, degree of intravascular volume deficit in dengue shock would always vary. Input is generally greater than output. So, because a lot of whatever you're giving is getting extravasated into your peritoneal cavity and pleural fluid. So, just do not wait for intake-output chart or input and output as a measurement of what is happening here. So, that is no good for management of the patient. Again, less than 30% hematocrit trigger for blood transfusion is not applicable to severe dengue. Why? As a lot of time bleeding is preceded by plasma leakage, and that's why hematocrit would generally be very high in a situation when there is already a plasma leakage taken place. So 30% cutoff is no good to set a criteria for blood transfusion. And the general guideline is it is considered low in children and male adults when it is less than 40% and below 45% in females. But mind you, if the patient is dynamically stable with decrease in hematocrit, it would indicate a major hemorrhage. If the signs and symptoms and output is good and there is a fall in hematocrit, that would indicate hemodilution, and you should then stop giving fluid therapy. I have seen patients are being unnecessarily infused even after they have stabilized, which would cause further problem of fluid overload in these patients. So this is what you should be doing. If the patient has compensated shock, systolic pressure is maintained but has signs of reduced perfusion, fluid resuscitation with isotonic crystalloid, 5 to 10 milligram per kilogram over an hour. Improvement, reduce it to 5 to 7 per kilogram per hour for 1 to 2 hours, then 3 to 5, then 2 to 3. If patient continues to improve, fluid can be further reduced. Monitor hematocrit 6 to 8 hourly. If patient is not stable, act according to hematocrit levels. If hematocrit increases, consider bolus fluid again or increase fluid administration. If the hematocrit decreases, consider transfusion with fresh blood. You can stop this within 48 hours in most of the patients. In case hematocrit, there is no improvement with this bolus infusion, you can look into hematocrit high or low. If it is low, you would have to consider significant occult or overt bleeding in these patients, then you will have to give blood replacement. If it improves with that, you continue with this and gradually taper it off. If it doesn't, then go back to this and look into this. So hematocrit may be a simple, good tool for you to monitor. Of course, all other vital signs you'll have to monitor. In case patient is in hypotensive shock, you may have to use high volume, 20 ml per kilogram, given very rapidly, and then again follow this chart. So doing hematocrit every 6 hourly might be a good option in first 48 hours in these patients. Now look into some of the other ideas that should we be using corticosteroids in dengue illness? No. There is definitely no role about that. Although this study, which has analyzed 7 studies in children, including 9 patients to 98 patients, and equivocal results you find in 3 studies, there was good response. But overall analysis shows that it has no benefit. And similarly, if you look into low-dose dexamethasone in severely thrombocytopenic patient caused by dengue fever in placebo-controlled study, they found that there was no difference between the 2 groups, whether it was given dexamethasone or not. There is no the use of giving prophylactic platelet transfusion, you can see in this study, and it has not been helpful in providing. I'm just winding up. Similarly, there is no role of prevention of transfusion in dengue shock syndrome. Is it necessary? probably it is not necessary. It may help in reducing your pulmonary edema and length of hospitalization, but not the overall outcome. So similarly, crystalloid versus colloid, colloid would help you in getting a recovery little early, but ultimate outcome is similar in both the groups. There was one interesting study, with permission of the chair for half a minute, that if the patient has come to you with increased fluid intake before he comes to you, in the previous 24 hours, probably has a better outcome, may even not need hospitalization. And finally, if you look into time from the development of shock and administration of the fluid, as early as you start fluid therapy, better is the outcome in these patients. So to carry home a message is that early detection of the shock and intervention is important. Choice of fluid is not significant, but early and aggressive replacement is needed. Serial hematocrit values are good tools for monitoring. Use of blood and blood products is only indicated in special situations. Routine use of platelets has to be avoided, and care should be observed while administering other supportive therapies. Thank you very much.